What's going on, everybody? We are back with another episode of the podcast, and this is going to be one that I do maybe a little bit more often. This is a solo episode, and I don't do solo episodes all the time. I honestly don't really like them. I like being able to talk to other people. But as I continue to advance my career as an academic and as a researcher, I think it's important for me to try and relate some of the things that I'm currently doing or some of the things that I'm reading to powerlifting or to strength training as a whole. And so this episode, and maybe I'll do this like once a month, twice a month, something like that. This is essentially titled like cool paper I read this week, right? And in these types of episodes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just tell you about a cool paper that I read and try and relate some of the findings to coaching, to strength training, to powerlifting as a whole, okay? And so that's going to be kind of the basis of this episode. Should be around maybe 15, 25 minutes, unsure yet. I do tend to ramble about this kind of stuff, so we'll see. Before I hop into that, though, of course, got to thank my boy Kevin Papa. Got to thank 110%. They support the podcast. They support me as an athlete. I love their pre-workout. If you're looking for a new pre-workout, highly suggest checking them out. I'll have a link to papastuffs.com, their website, in the description. Try literally any flavor, and I guarantee you, you're going to like it. By far the best tasting pre-workout. Not only the best working, but the best tasting pre-workout I've ever had. They've also got some really cool apparel. So if you do want to try out a new pre-workout, I highly suggest using them. You can use code ROB at their checkout as well for around 10% off, okay? Second, I have a new shirt on. And this shirt, Escalate in the front, I'll maybe put up a picture of what it looks like on the back, was designed by Dion Markel. Dion is a graphic designer for Worker, Sean Mills, Dion, that whole group out of Houston. And I hired him to do this graphic. With it being, I realized this literally today, with it being 5 years in 2025 since I started Escalate, I figured that I'd do maybe like a 5-year anniversary apparel drop where I drop some new apparel. I haven't done that in a while, so this will be one of the shirts. If you're interested in it, be on the lookout for a pre-order link. We're going to do everything through pre-order for this, so there's no missed sizes or anything. Lastly, with us going into April, or this being April already, I'm unsure when I'm going to publish this. I do have some spots open for coaching, whether that be lifestyle coaching or powerlifting coaching. If you would want to work with me or just learn a little bit more about my coaching style and training system, let me know. You can reach out on Instagram. You can reach out and just fill out the inquiry form. Both of those will be in the description below. And so hit me up on either, and I'll be able to find you and talk to you a little bit more about your goals and how I can come in and help you achieve them. I'd love to be able to have you join the team. But without further ado, what we're going to do now, after I take a sip of water, what we're going to do now is discuss the cool paper that I read this week. And the cool paper that I read this week was Corticospinal Responses Following Strength Training, a systematic review and meta-analysis. Lots of words that you guys probably don't understand, lots of words that I barely understand. Corticospinal Responses. Corticospinal tract is the main tract of the spinal cord that allows us to move voluntarily. So if I want to tap on the computer in front of me, there's going to be signals sent through the corticospinal tract. If I want to, unrack the bar, there's going to be signals sent through the corticospinal tract. Everything that we do, corticospinal tract to the actual muscle, regarding movement, at least voluntary movement. And essentially what they're doing is they're looking at how resistance training as a whole affects our neuromuscular system. Now, we know that resistance training affects the neuromuscular system at the distal level, meaning at the actual muscle itself. We get stuff like hypertrophy, strength hypertrophy, as well as sarcolemmic hypertrophy, i.e. the increase in strength or the increase in muscle size. I think it's called sarcolemmic hypertrophy. Don't quote me on that. But what they're looking at is more central nervous system neuromuscular adaptations from resistance training. And more specifically, they are looking at how does resistance training change how our brain sends signals to the muscle, right? How does it change that corticospinal tract or the corticospinal responses? And so what they were looking at here and what they did was something called a meta-analysis. So if you guys are not familiar with what that means, a meta-analysis is essentially a study of studies. They pooled together, I think in this paper, it was around 20 studies to look at their pooled results. Basically what this allows them to do is pull data from multiple empirical findings and increase the effect size or find trends in the data itself. And they did that by first screening around 1,000 articles. I think they had 961. And from their screening process, using inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, they narrowed it down to about 20 studies that they looked at. And through these 20 studies, they looked at studies that used resistance training and studies that used a technique called TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is something that I've used in the past for research that I've done, experiments that I've ran. I'll be using it probably far in my academic career. It's a great way to look at changes to the corticospinal tract. And in a career of motor learning and motor control, that is a huge thing to look at, right? And they used multiple techniques from TMS. And I'm going to do a little bit of background here so that you guys can understand each of these techniques in TMS as a whole. So transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, uses something called a figure of 8 coil. And it uses that to basically send a magnetic pulse that then induces an electrical pulse on some sort of conductive material. In this case, and in the case, throughout all of these studies and the stuff that I do, that electrically conductive material is the brain tissue. So we put it over our motor cortex, or M1, which you'll hear me say both of those. So motor cortex means M1, TMS means transcranial magnetic stimulation. You put TMS over M1, and then you send a signal, and the magnetic pulse induces electrical potentials on the surface of the actual brain tissue. And if you were to do it over your arm, it would work a lot like a TENS unit. That's the way that I always kind of give an example. And maybe I'll actually pull up a video of me doing it in our lab here so you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about. There's, changes where I put it on my forearm and my fingers twitch, and then also my hand or arm will twitch as I put it over my actual skull. So it, conducts it to the brain tissue itself. And TMS can be used in a lot of different ways. Most simply, we use TMS to look at something called corticospinal excitability, or the actual excitability of the brain tissue and the corticospinal tract for voluntary movement. That would be done through something called single pulse TMS. That's something that they do here. We're going to look at something called the cortical silent period within that reading that we get from a muscle recording to see what resistance training changes in the corticospinal path. So they use single pulse TMS to look at actual corticospinal excitability. We can also use paired pulse TMS, either single coil or 2 coils on the brain, to look at how different areas interact with each other. And then lastly, and with that before I move on, with that dual coil or single coil paired pulse TMS, what you can do is look at facilitatory or inhibitory pathways, or excitatory or inhibitory pathways within the brain, how different brain regions interact. They look at something called short intracortical inhibition, as well as, I believe they do interhemispheric inhibition. I don't remember or not, but I remember seeing intracortical or interhemispheric inhibition as well, which basically mean the inhibition between the 2 hemispheres of the motor cortex. But what we'll be talking about today is short intracortical inhibition, or the same cortex. So just the left cortex or just the right cortex of the motor system. Where was I at? Sorry. And then also TMS can be used to inhibit or excite specific brain regions. So we can use repetitive TMS, which sends a bunch of different pulses to our motor cortex or other regions of the brain to inhibit or downregulate, inhibit, or upregulate, facilitate, or excite specific brain regions. So, for example, TMS is widely used in the treatment of depression, actually. I think it's approved by the FDA. And what they do is they might inhibit a region that is highly correlated with symptoms of depression, and put that TMS coil over the frontal lobe somewhere, and then send a signal over 30 minutes to an hour, over and over and over again, hundreds and thousands of pulses. And that brain region will be inhibited, meaning that hopefully depression systems decrease. In something like a motor learning task, we might inhibit something like, I'll choose something at random here, the supplementary motor area. So the supplementary motor area is in the premotor cortex, or kind of near the frontal lobe, and it deals with sequencing actions together. So how we sequence stuff, how we can go from humeral flexion or shoulder flexion to elbow flexion to grabbing a cup out in front of you, sequence of actions. If I were to inhibit that and then tell you to do a sequence of key presses on a keyboard, you might not be better. You might not be as good at it using repetitive TMS. So in whole, TMS can be used in a bunch of different ways. In this specific meta-analysis, we'll be looking at it used in single pulse and dual pulse. Okay, those are the only two that we're looking at. Now, they did dual pulse over a single cortex. I talked about that already with SICI and short intracortical inhibition. And then they did the single pulse stuff overall. So going into the findings, so we kind of overwent TMS. Obviously, also, they looked at resistance training. I don't remember whether they looked at specifically isometric resistance training, eccentric resistance training, concentric resistance training, but for the sake of this podcast episode, we're just going to call it resistance or strength training as a whole. You can think of that as powerlifting, right? If you're a powerlifter, you can think of that as you going in and doing your powerlifting sessions or your training sessions, right? Now, the findings. Overall strength gains increased due to resistance training. Huge surprise there. I'm just going to get that one out of the way. They did strength training and they got stronger. Whew. Means that their methods were great, right? Okay, cool. We know that. We know that there are strength adaptations at the level of the muscle. And like I said, that has been shown before in multiple other, in a bunch of different literature, and obviously anecdotally to everybody that powerlifts, right? You do resistance training, you powerlift, you've seen yourself get stronger. Now, of the 12 studies that looked at specific, so we're going to look at three different things here, right? We're going to look at something called a motor threshold. We're going to look at something called a cortical silent period. And we're going to look at something called the short intracortical inhibition. I've kind of alluded to two of those, the cortical silent period and SICI, or short intracortical inhibition. I'm also going to be talking about the motor threshold. So what is the motor threshold? The motor threshold is essentially kind of the threshold or the barrier of excitability to induce some sort of change at the muscle level, right? So if I were to be using TMS single pulse, so just giving one pulse over my motor cortex, I would have to reach a specific intensity of TMS or a specific percentage of TMS to actually see something in the muscle itself, in the EMG recording. So I didn't mention this, but TMS is often paired with electromyography or EMG, which is muscle recording, to look at these different things. And everything that you do with TMS in motor neuroscience or motor learning, you're likely using it in paired with muscle recording. So you can actually see a change in the muscle activity. So of the 12 studies, so they started with 961, they went down to 20. Of the 12 studies that looked at changes to motor threshold, meaning excitability of the motor cortex itself, not just of the muscle, but of the actual brain tissue, strength training in general did not have any effect across the board. So what does that mean? What does that mean? So we know that you have changes at the distal portion of your neuromuscular system, meaning the muscle itself and probably the nerves surrounding that, the motor units. However, as you get changes at the distal point, the proximal point, or the point all the way up in the brain, most central point, strength training didn't have any effect, meaning that it doesn't inherently increase or decrease the excitability of the brain tissue. And this was a little bit surprising for me, actually, because transcranial magnetic stimulation has been used to look at motor thresholds in learning in general. And it's been shown across the board that after you learn a specific task, again, looking at like a sequence task, after you learn a specific sequence of key presses, your threshold actually does decrease for the musculature involved in those key presses. So I was a little surprised to see this, but nonetheless, pretty cool finding, right? You get changes at the distal point or at the muscular level, but not all the way back up to the actual brain tissue. which is really, really cool. So while strength training can show changes at the muscular level of the neuromuscular system, it actually doesn't show a ton of changes all the way up to the brain tissue. So overall, no change to motor threshold from resistance training or strength training as a whole. However, when we look at inhibitory circuits, when we look at stuff that inhibits our motor cortex, we do see some marked changes, some huge changes due to resistance training. And the two things that we're going to look at to show that there were changes to inhibitory circuits are the cortical silent period being the first one, and changes in short interval intracortical inhibition. It's a mouthful. I'm just going to start referring to it as SICI. So the CSP, cortical silent period, and SICI. So what is the cortical silent period? Let's define that first. This is an inherent decrease in muscle activity shown in the EMG after a signal is sent to the musculature itself, kind of induced by TMS, or basically the time needed to have the signal return back to its resting state, right? And so if I were to just sit here and just be, sitting here quietly with EMG on my bicep, for example, we're going to see some sort of electrical activity. Now, if I were to give a TMS pulse to the region of the motor cortex that corresponds to my bicep, we're going to see something called a motor evoked potential. Now, I'll show a picture of that on the screen, and I'll show a picture also of what the cortical silent period is. But the motor evoked potential is essentially the kind of amplitude or the muscle activity induced by transcranial magnetic stimulation or TMS. And that cortical silent period that happens after that signal is the amount of time that it takes to return back to a resting state of muscle activity. It's actually going to decrease that activity after increasing it tremendously. It's going to decrease it, and then we're going to return to a resting state. And this is mediated by inhibitory pathways, right? It basically is allowing your motor units, your neuromuscular system, to continue to be used. And if we can decrease that cortical silent period, essentially what we can do is we can decrease that inhibition, meaning that you can kind of take the brakes off. You can open the gate for more rate coding, more motor units to be activated more quickly. So I'm going to dive a little bit into the details here of cortical silent period and why decreasing inhibition can be a good thing, right? Now, the cortical silent period is mediated by something called gamma aminobutyric acid B. Now, GABA as a whole, GABA A and GABA B, they're both inhibitory neurotransmitters. GABA B, though, involves slow inhibition. This uses some stuff like secondary messenger systems to actually hyperpolarize the neuron or bring it down below its normal resting state to then get back up and kind of recover as a whole. Now, is decreasing the effect from GABA B, this slow inhibition, a good thing? In strength training, in performance, I would say yes, especially when it involves maybe something with brute force like powerlifting. Maybe stuff that is a little bit more finesse, a little bit more technique. I know there's a lot of technique in powerlifting, but I'm thinking of stuff like tennis, ping pong, stuff like that. A lot of fine motor skills. This might not be such a good idea, right? Because you want inhibition there. You want to be able to stop the signal so that you can change directions, or stop the signal so that you can fine tune your actual movement. However, in something like powerlifting, where it's just brute force strength, it's how much force you can produce in a single rep overall, this is a great thing. So a decrease in the cortical silent period from strength training shows adaptations to decrease these inhibitory mechanisms from the corticomuscular system or from that corticospinal tract, which could potentially lead to more sustained motor unit rate coding and more effective force generation for maximal loads from improved neuromuscular efficiency. There's a lot of words in there, right? I'm going to kind of break it down a little bit simpler. Essentially what we're doing is, like I said, we're taking the brakes off. We're opening the gate. And so when we're trying to produce more force as a whole, we are attempting two different things. One can be from more motor units being activated, so larger motor units being activated, meaning that they basically recruit more musculature as a whole. And number 2 being improved rate coding or improved motor unit firing rates, how quick they can fire. Now, if we're able to decrease that cortical silent period and return to resting state, we're able to have another fire happen. We're able to have another MEP at a faster or a quicker way or a quicker time period, right? And so we're able to increase our rate coding, which at the end of the day, like I said, increases our force production. So we're releasing the brake, us being able to do strength training and increase our strength as a whole from the corticospinal system, from the actual central nervous system. It allows us to basically release the brake, allows us to fire more efficiently and produce more force as a whole. Now, I also said that we're going to talk about something called SICI, or short interval intracortical inhibition. Now, what is SICI? So SICI is a TMS technique that uses 2 shortly separated TMS pulses, normally by 3 to 5 milliseconds, 2 to 5 milliseconds, within a single hemisphere, meaning it's only over the right or only over the left, depending on which limb you're looking at, of the motor cortex itself. Now, both this and the cortical silent period, as mentioned, are both mediated by gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, which, as noted, is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Now, GABA-B is with cortical silent period, is with the cortical silent period, meaning cortical silent period is mediated by GABA-B. GABA-A, which is our fast inhibition, that is more in line with SICI as a whole. So we know that resistance training or strength training as a whole allows us to release this kind of slow brake. Now, does it also allow us to release this fast brake, this kind of, very sharp brake that happens? And the answer is yes. The answer as a whole is yes. SICI decreased with resistance training, meaning that there was less inhibition actually within the motor cortex itself. Meaning, again, we're able to recruit more motor units more efficiently, and we're able to increase rate coding as a whole. And so, like I said, this basically allows us to increase our force production. Now, those were the 2 big findings that I basically concluded on from this paper. If you guys are wanting to look at this paper as a whole, I highly suggest doing so. If you're not familiar with reading scientific literature, this can be a little bit of a troublesome article, in my opinion, simply because it's a meta-analysis. There's a lot of stuff in the methods section that you probably don't really need to pay attention to. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you are going to take a look at this paper and you're not familiar with reading scientific literature, read the introduction for sure. Read the introduction, read the abstract, and then also read through some of the discussion. I think if you go into the results, it can be a little bit, it might be a little bit confusing. So read some of the discussion, read what the researchers doing this meta-analysis were trying to drive home, and come to your own conclusions. That's the biggest thing here. My conclusion from this article is that through resistance training, through strength training, we are able to, as a whole, the big finding, we're able to, as a whole, release the brake. We're able to open the gate for more motor unit rate coding, for more force production, because there is increased neuromuscular efficiency from the central nervous system. Like I said, that's already been shown at distal portions of the neuromuscular system, meaning the actual motor unit and the actual muscle itself through hypertrophy. However, now we can see that strength training as a whole also kind of has adaptations to the central nervous system too, which is really cool. So if you did enjoy this, I thank you. If you've made it this far, there was a lot of rambling here. Please, let me know if this is something that you want to see in the future. Shoot me a text if you know me. DM me on Instagram. My Instagram's in the bio if this is something that you like listening to. I know that I really liked putting this together. It gave me an opportunity to teach you guys a little bit more about my world in academia. And as always, If you do enjoy any episode of the podcast, I highly recommend, or not recommend, I would highly appreciate if you rated it, subscribe, stuff like that. That is a very easy way for me to grow the podcast. And so I would highly appreciate that. Again, if you made it this far, thank you. I appreciate you. And be on the lookout for more of these episodes. Like I said, I love making this one. And then as always, continue climbing.